comes the nerfs, all dressed in blue. Ladies and gentlemen, in an almost maniacal twist to our video on Sunday, just 2 days later, Blizzard decided to crush the Stone General's mythic into the ground, which is ironic. I'm certainly not responsible for this, as much as I would willing to take credit. It has been a sore spot with every guild that's done it, which isn't many. It's about 60, which I'm happy to say includes mine. Yes, after we did release that video on Sunday, we did manage to defeat the Stone Legion Generals in its pre-nerf state. I'm kind of happy with that. There's something so horrible about working on a boss that is incredibly hard, and certainly one that is also incredibly broken, and then it gets nerfed when you're close to a kill. It's happened to me a couple of times in my life. It happens recently. Before this one would have been Guam, actually, so it hasn't happened for a couple of expansions. But it's an awful feeling. You're fully capable of killing it. You've put in the time, you've put in the effort, and then Blizzard goes and crushes it, and you walk in and you just kill it. Now, that's sad, but also, although my Twitter feed was like, you're going to be so pissed, right? The prediction was that I'd be so angry about this. I'm not. I'm not angry about this. One, because we already killed it. I'm kind of happy about that. We're working on Mythic Denathrius now, and we should hopefully pick up that kill relatively quickly. But I'm really happy that nobody else has to go through what we went through on the Stone Legion Generals. Defeating a boss that is incredibly difficult, incredibly long, and incredibly bugged is no fun. So what exactly did they do to it? Well, basically, they addressed all the concerns I had, and then more, which is insane. It's absolutely insane. They went even further than that. They reduced the health of the Goliaths by 10%. They also nerfed the duration between casting the Ravenous Feast. So if you're not sure, if you've never done Mythic, the Goliaths that spawn during the fight, and you get 3 per phase of the boss being alive up until the last phase, they do a charge onto you, which then causes Ravenous Feast. They pick someone out of the raid to do Ravenous Feast on. By the second one, if you're not getting a bop or having that damage intervened or something on those lines, you're instantly dead. And if it ever casts a third one, that person is instantly dead. If it touches you at all with the Ravenous Feast, you are dead. There's nothing you can do about it. So it looks like now it'll change from 2 feasts with a risk of a third. If something's gone wrong with your DPS, you should never get a third, to perhaps only 1, which is an enormous benefit of quality of life improvement. This is huge. This is absolutely enormous. It's not even the biggest change they've made. They did nerf the health of the skirmishers by 6%. Skirmishers, not a big deal. They're more to control your DPS. You don't want to try and DPS all 3 of them at the exact same time. That causes massive problems. These are mythic only adds. You don't see them even in heroic. But what they do is once they approach their near-death state is they'll start blowing winds off the platform. And if you change all 3 of them to that nearly low health, so they're all using the winds, you get blown off the platform. So they're really more of a controlled DPS, so you want to get them low, then finish one, finish another, finish the third one. You certainly don't want all 3 doing it at the same time. They nerfed the tank damage by 20% on all its abilities. But then what they did to compensate was stop some of the scams that were happening during the fight. And you might see some of that going on in the background footage, is that the abilities that the boss did to the tanks and to the raid had a very small range. What this meant is the tanks were actually tanking miles away from the raid, certainly during intermission phases. They were going out and standing all on their own and jumping around the platform to prevent taking damage, because the abilities the boss did had a very small range. It was like 10 and 20 yards. Now they've made them 100 yards. So no longer will tanks be able to just drag the boss out and survive on their own for really extended periods of time, because the boss is just going to hit you anyway. So this is nice. This is actually quite a nice thing. It's dumb that it used to work the other way. I know some of you are thinking like, what was going on? This is how dumb this fight was. So what you would do is during the intermission phases, the tanks would just run off to the other side of the platform completely on their own. Occasionally a healer would go out and throw a heal on them. And it would usually be a Vengeance Demon Hunter, and they would just jump around the platform on their own, avoiding mechanics so that they didn't take any damage. And they would just do that for minutes while we dealt with the rest of the fight. Similarly, they changed Heart Rend. This is the debuff that went out on several players. I believe it was like 5 players. It might be less. It's a healer problem, I don't really care. But the Heart Rend is a debuff that needs to be dispelled, or you can let it run off and then it gets dispelled anyway. The problem in Mythic is that whoever dispelled it also got the second debuff that comes with it, which is a very nasty dot. So players would get this dot, it needs to be dispelled or removed, and once that's done, people then, whoever dispelled it, would get that debuff as well, and then you'd have more, twice as many people with this debuff. And the way teams were countering this and this was no fun for the guy who had to do it, and I felt really bad that for one of our players who had to do it, is that you would have a priest mass dispel it and die with an Ankh totem. And they would do that a couple of times throughout the fight. They would just start the fight, food buffed up, go in, and within 20 seconds they were killing themselves, getting res, then killing themselves again, in order to prevent having to heal this extra debuff that would happen for the people that dispelled it. Now, later on, you had to manage it, because you just can't kill somebody over and over and over and over again. Well, you can, but it's not ideal to do that. So now what they've done is changed it so that it no longer even puts that second dot out on whoever dispelled it. It just doesn't happen. This is an enormous nerf. Like, this is huge. This is so much better for the healers, but it also means that they've changed Heart Rend so it can't be outranged. When I was telling you the tanks were bouncing around, one of the things they were also doing by pulling the boss to the other side of the platform was preventing the Heart Rend from being cast on the raid. In fact, sometimes they were manipulating pets to try and take these debuffs that were hitting the tank and stuff like that. You'd have Void Walkers and stuff following the boss around, not doing anything, hitting immune targets just so they could kind of snack some of these debuffs and the raid wouldn't get them. So they've changed it now so Heart Rend will always go out, but no longer when it's dispelled will it go onto the people who dispelled it. So this is another massive, massive nerf. And they have actually put in here is like, look, what we've done is change this fight so that you have to deal with all the mechanics. That's still there, but we've nerfed nearly every single aspect of the fight. And what we've also done is a massive, massive change, which is make sure the boss resets its timers when changing phase. So this is another thing we talked about, is that the way spell queuing works, we talked about that in our Artificer video, is that depending on whatever you did with the fight, changed what the boss would do in about 1 minute to 2 minutes time. And this really drastically altered the difficulty of the fight, meaning that a lot of your attempts at this fight were just trying to get the boss to change phase at really exact times. And when I tell you that we had spreadsheets that were like, it must realistically be at 7:31. It must really be at 2 minutes 41 seconds. If it doesn't happen at 2 minutes 41 seconds, it's a shit show afterwards. It's an absolute nightmare. And that's because the boss would carry over its timers even when it couldn't use them. So then you go into the next phase and you'd have a whole slurry of mechanics back to back in orders that just didn't make sense. And pull by pull, what you'd have, if you couldn't get that exact like second of transfer or a phase change, then the boss would do totally different things in the next phase, and often that would lead to a wipe. These were all the difficulties we were dealing with in Mythic. So, along with some other nerfs, they have crushed the Stone Generals into the ground. And again, my finale on this, as much as people want to be hating on this, this is great news. This is great news for everybody who's tackling this, and I'm really happy that they took a boss that was, as we said in the first video, undercooked, that just did not have the time and development time put into it to make it a really nice, tight, tidy fight, and change it into something that is consistent, that is very manageable, and should allow a lot of people to overcome this hurdle without having to go through the stress and, more importantly, the frustration of having to deal with a lot of how this fight works in its original state. So while I do feel some sympathy for those guys who were nearly there on the kill and now have to deal with a different fight, I think overall those guys should be okay with getting past this, as it's not the last boss, and I think that's an important thing to take away. It is not the last boss. It's fine to get past Stone Legion Generals. It's not the important kill. So, thank God, just 2 days after. And I am glad I got the kill. I'm not going to lie about that. The next thing I really want to talk about is, of course, we brought the MDI. How ironic, right? The video we made talking about Stone Legion Generals and the MDI. The MDI has resulted in the Necrotic Wake being smashed into the goddamn ground. My God. Now, Necrotic Wake is not surprising, as it's the target of all these nerfs. Several of the Mythic dungeons got nerfs. We didn't see any like mega changes to Mists of Turn Aside, which was, of course, the kind of highlight of blunders during the MDI. But what we did see is Blizzard go ham on a couple of dungeons, including Plaguefall's last boss, usually a particularly bad boss for a lot of pugs to deal with, especially that Infectious Rain. That has been dealt with. But Necrotic Wake got absolutely hammered. And the reason for this is quite obvious. Necrotic Wake is designed around using the tools that are lying around on the floor inside Necrotic Wake. And the problem, and this is very obvious for anybody who's done a few Mythic Pluses right now, when one thing goes wrong in the Necrotic Wake, you are so far behind. It's insane. The loss of those tools, dealing with some of the trash packs in there without those tools, that is a knock-on snowballing effect that really puts you in for a bad time. and it's not fun. So they've really hammered it. Not only did they nerf nearly every single mob that's considered the dangerous ones, so those would be your corpse harvesters and your corpse collectors. Those are the ones that are casting those spells where your party just dies or you get stunned for like 7 seconds. The frostbolt volleys where your party just dies, things like that. Not only have they nerfed their HP and those big chunky abominations that are wrecking your tank as soon as you got upstairs. Like, you've been dealing with the trash pack normally, and then this guy just wrecks your tank, and your tank's running around like a lunatic trying not to get hammered. They've nerfed all those. But the biggest change here is that if you die while holding one of the weapons, so if you're holding the spear or holding the forge light hammer, you no longer lose those weapons. Which was what was happening originally, is that if you died, you just lost them. So you'd have a guy carrying the spear and the hammer, and you're preparing to use it at certain parts of the dungeon. Something goes slightly wrong, and that person dies, and now you've lost enormous amounts of DPS potential. One of the big reasons for this, of course, is this is where the big snap was found, or utilized during the MDI to a wider audience, where guilds were utilizing these tools, such as the Anima Orb, in order to wipe out the entire top floor of Necrotic Wake by just standing in there with the orb. So in counter of the fact that you no longer lose the weapons and stuff when you die, they've made it so that if you're using it on lots and lots of enemies, there's diminishing returns on it. So specifically, the Bloody Javelin and the Discharged Anima, if it hits more than 8 targets, the total damage is still there, but it's going to be distributed evenly across all targets. Meaning what you can't do, which is what the guilds, a lot of teams were doing during the MDI, is pull and as many mobs as possible locked into one singular place, throw a spear right through all of them so they just absolutely get annihilated, and stand next to them with the orb so they can't even cast spells, because it was too much. Let's be honest, it was far too much. It was also incredibly dangerous, and Blizzard absolutely does not want casual groups trying to pull off something along those lines. And so that has been nerfed as well. It's kind of amazing exactly how many nerfs went into this, because although I've mentioned those two and the nerfing of the trash packs, the bosses were not immune either. Carrion Worm's Bloodgorge. So the first boss, the big abomination Blightbone, you'll know he spawns these worms, and if they hit people 3 times, it generally AoEs and kills the entire party. Not particularly fun. They've upped that to 5. So for the most part, you can probably, even though they hit very hard, you can pretty much stand there and just AoE them down in a more efficient way than trying to kite them. Far too many times, I'm sure you guys have had this experience as well, is running into that dungeon, then worms start chasing people and people just running circles around the place, especially in a disorganized group, which is what a lot of the changes to the dungeons are for. They're not for the top MDI players, they're for disorganized groups who are just trying to get their weekly done. So a lot of changes there. Similar with the second boss, the big dragon thing. They've reduced it so he doesn't spawn ads too far away, so that having a DK or something was an absolutely enormous help compared to groups that didn't have it. Being able to drag mobs in, especially that you've got two caster mobs in the forms of the mages, and you've got a crossbowman as well. That's 3 enemies that are at range, so you've got a combination of, if you've got no Death Knight or something to grip them in or knock them in, then you've got some kind of kiting around, you've got to organize interrupts, and generally speaking, that is too much for people who are trying to get their 6, 7, 8s, 9s, 10s, all the way up to 14s done, just at one run on a weekly basis. That makes the whole life significantly easier for them. There's not a massive disparity in whether or not you've got a Death Knight, for example. So that's pretty cool. They also swapped out Surgeon Stitch Flesh a little bit for groups that have issues getting the hook in. That's typically what the problem is getting the hook into Surgeon when he flies up on the platform. And he fills the floor with his embalming ichor. So they've removed that from 6 minutes, so it basically just filled the room up. If you missed 1 or 2 of these hooks, and we've all been in that scenario where it's happened, that the floor is entirely full and there's just nowhere to stand anymore, now they only last 1 minute. So if you do end up in that scenario and you can keep up with the abominations that are spawning, you're not going to run into a secondary problem, which is there's just nowhere to stand anymore in order to position him for the hook to go in. So that's a big help for groups that have made a mistake. And I think that's what this sums up. Although some people have been very angry that it didn't need nerfs, FFS, I see a lot of groups who do struggle with this stuff, and I will always go by the standard, and I apply this to raiding as well. One mistake should not be the actual detriment of the entire run. Mistakes happen. Whether or not it's player-based, even in an online game, it can be lag, a disconnect, or whatever. Having one mistake kill the entire run, it's bad enough in a raid where you're dealing with some of the harder mythic fights where one mistake can just be a wipe, and you have to go again. In a Mythic Plus dungeon, it's a lot longer than a singular... Excuse me for that. in a mythic dungeon, it's a lot longer of a time to be trying to recover from that mistake. And I see it this way. It's like, if you weren't making mistakes in the first place, this is just a slightly easier dungeon. That's it. If you were in a group that was pugging and having the odd mistake, some players aren't pulling their weight and stuff, then you're no longer overly punished for it. And that's fine. I think that's a totally okay approach to have with these scenarios. So 2 big changes that have come literally a couple of days after we make a video showing off these big problems that people are having in these dungeons. Very, very cool to see. And well played, Blizzard. Well played. Thank you very much for listening, guys, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye.